The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show, the home of geek, folklore and paranormal entertainment, with me, Charles Christian. So once again, we delve into the worlds of weirdness, urban myths, geek culture, ghosts, magic, witchcraft, the occult, and anything else I think will intrigue you. Looking through the diary, I can see that this weekend, technically the Sunday nearest the 26th of August, is Go Topless Day in the United States. This supports the right of women to go topless on gender equality grounds. The argument being, if men can have a constitutional right to walk around bare-chested, then why can't women? Go Topless Days have been taking place since 2007, when it was set up in Nevada by Rael, the leader of the Raelian UFO religion, because, well, perhaps female aliens go around topless. I don't know. Anyway, on with the show. We've another fantastic guest for you this week, the journalist and author Nick Cook, who is going to be taking us through all the A's, as in Aliens, Arthur C. Clarke, Asymmetrical Warfare and Area 51. Nick Cook is a storyteller and with a background in business consulting and technical journalism. He has written 20 fiction and non-fiction books, including a number of ghost-written Sunday Times bestsellers. His own non-fiction, The Hunt for Zero Point, was an Amazon bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, while his latest thriller, The Grid, was one of the London Times Books of the Year in 2019. Nick started out as a technology reporter for the well-known military affairs journal Jane's Defence Weekly in the 1980s, rising to become its award-winning aerospace editor, and has maintained a strong interest in technology and technology trends ever since. After Jane's, he set up the consultancy Dynamics, working at the top levels of the aerospace and defence industry to find solutions to global grand challenges such as climate change, renewable energy, pollution, and sustainable/smart resilient cities. Nick, great to be speaking to you. Now, you've had a wonderful and varied career, starting out in technical journalism in the 80s, and then going on into consultancy, and you're also doing fiction now, and you've also ghost-written some bestsellers, which obviously I appreciate you can't talk about. But let's go back to some of your technology work. You were writing for Jane's Defence Weekly in the 1980s.
I was.
How did you get that gig?
Well, I'd written for another publication, which sadly no longer exists now, called Area Aerospace Review. That was my very first job out of university. And I joined them in 1983. And it was a very nuts and boltsy kind of trade journal based in Switzerland. But I was their sort of UK outpost. And it taught me everything really I needed to know about the aerospace industry from the ground up. I was literally sent out on all the sort of press jobs that no one else wanted. But it was a very good education because, you know, I would learn all about sort of widget manufacturers. And I really got to understand, I think, the way that the aerospace industry works, as I said, from the ground up. So I was with them until 1986, and then I joined Jane's Defence Weekly as a reporter. I think in 87, I got promoted to the aerospace editor, and I remained aerospace editor at Jane's Defence Weekly until 2005, I think. So, and then I went on to consulting work. As you said, I'd always written books sort of in between then and evenings and weekends.
Yeah.
So my day job was James and my sort of alternate job was writing. But now I sort of consider myself first and foremost to be a writer, I think.
Right. One of the things you say you do, and I was looking on your website, is storytelling, but for businesses. Now,
Yeah.
I've seen this phrase mentioned quite a lot. Just for the benefit of people who don't know, what exactly is it? I mean, it's not storytelling as in you wear a romper suit and you sit on a stool and tell funny stories, but it's a concept of helping businesses get across an issue or a story to their customers or the public, is it?
In essence, yes. It really arose, I think, out of the just the sort of sheer volumes of information that are out there online. And of course, that in a rather dry sense is called content. But there's so much content out there that in order to differentiate what you want to get across to your audience, and that might be a customer, or it might be a supplier, or it might even be an internal audience within the company, you need to engage heart as well as brain.
Yeah.
And the best way to do that is by telling a story, storifying the message that you want to get across. And that, as you say, is not sort of me dressing up as Tinky Winky or, any other Teletubby for that matter, but it is about finding that part of the story or finding the part of the content that would engage the hearts and minds of those you're trying to reach. It's really as simple as that. And since I've been doing both those things, I've as a technology journalist, I was very focused and still am focused on the nuts and bolts of technology and the data-driven part of that. But there's the other side of me, the right brain part, which is the storyteller, the book writer, the author. And sort of merging those two things enables me to work for corporate clients, which I occasionally do.
Yes, I mean, you do sometimes wonder whether government should get into that, because they don't seem to be able to get the messages across in simple ways, do they? Obviously, they tell stories, but they are of the porky pie variety. But
well, there's always that. I mean, that always goes on, and that's another topic of conversation in a way. It's the information, disinformation, and the in the field that I've come from, which is defense journalism. There is an information warfare aspect to how information is used to help achieve your aims on the battlefield, which is sort of an interesting concept, but it exists. I think definitely the thing that I'm talking about is quite. It's not nefarious. I mean, it is. It's an extension of public relations in a way. I mean, PR before the internet was about how you get the attention of a journalist to cover your story.
Yeah.
Well, it's now about how do you get the attention of a very saturated internet audience, a social media audience, to engage with what you're trying to get across. So, and to do that, you've got to make it interesting. You can't just convey data or send out a press release anymore. No one's going to read that, which is where the sort of the storifying aspect of it comes in.
Right, let's wind back to your time as a defence journalist. I've got in the notes here, you spent some time hanging out near Area 51 looking for black planes. Tell me more.
I have for my sins, yes. Well, back in the midst of time, before Area 51 was Area 51, it was a place called Groom Lake. And Groom Lake was and is an Air Force test center. It's in the middle of a range, an Air Force range in Nevada called the Nellis Air Force Test Range. That range is about the size of Switzerland. And that range is cordoned off. You are actively discouraged by all kinds of measures and means from entering it.
Yes.
And then, so as a Jane's editor, I was always aware that Groom Lake existed. It was where famous dark or secret programs like the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird were developed. Mm-hmm. But in the late 1980s, a whole bunch of news stories emerged out of Groom Lake, centered on the testimony of a guy, initially called Bob Lazar, mm-hmm. who talked about captured alien spacecraft being at Area 51. And that was what he called it, Area 51. And until that time, that name was not very familiar to outsiders. So in 1992, I was researching a book that I was working on, and I went out to the periphery of Area 51, the Nellis Air Force Ranges, and just hung around to see what I could see. And of course, it's extraordinary to think that's 30 years ago now, and Area 51 seems to have been in our lexicon forever. But back then, as I say, it was a relatively unknown term. And so I was curious to see what I could see.
Yeah. I mean, you say it's 30 years ago, but of course, one of the key things was that was really before the internet took off, wasn't it? I mean, before it became user-friendly with web browsers and things. And so we tend to forget just how little information there was other than going to reference books and newspapers and things. Yeah, exactly.
Very hard to find out anything. I mean, as you say, it is now so easy just to tap a word or a phrase, however unfamiliar it may be to you, into a search engine, and you get to where you want to go and find out what you need to find out, by and large. But yes, absolutely, Charles. Back then, it was a difficult research was much harder than it is today. That's for sure. And I probably wouldn't have gone out to Area 51 or even have needed to now. I would have just logged onto somebody's website and or a webcam, and I could have done it. But back then, I needed to make the expedition, which but always more fun to do it that way.
Yes. Did you actually see anything or find anything? Because, I mean, it's a huge area, so it's not as if it's like peering over the fence surrounding an airport or something. You are the perimeter fencing is a long way from anywhere, isn't it?
It is. So the first time I went there, and I went with a colleague as well, so there were two of us. The first time I went there, I think it was in March 1992. It was extremely cold. We sort of perched ourselves on a rock. I think it was about 12 or 15 miles from the base itself, which was about as close as you could get without being pulled over and interrogated. And the second time, we weren't that much closer, but I think we were a little bit higher up. The second time I did see something very interesting, and it looked very sort of UFO-like, a sort of red glowing ball of light. But there were sort of many. If I let my sort of Jane's hat kick in, there were many sort of explanations for what it could be. It didn't have to be a flying saucer. In fact, that was the very last thing that I thought it probably was.
Right.
But, and then there are other things too, like Soviet aircraft that were being tested out there. And I think the second time that I was out there, we saw some Russian aircraft, which the Americans weren't meant to have or didn't acknowledge they had.
Yes.
So those were also visible as well.
And you also, during this time, visited the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, which is sort of, if you like, the commercial end of the Area 51 almost.
Yeah, it's definitely the sort of the corporate connection to what is going or what has been going on at Area 51. Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works, which is the sort of top secret black classified bit of Lockheed, well, it was Lockheed, now Lockheed Martin, that has had a long association with Area 51 and Groom Lake because of the aircraft that were tested there. A number of them, in fact, most of them were Lockheed products in the early days. And so I went to the Skunk Works in, I think it was 96 or 97. I had to do an interview there with with the boss at the time. And that was an interesting experience for me because, as far as I was aware, journalists weren't allowed into the sort of the headquarters part of the Skunk Works, which is out in a town called Palmdale, which is on the edge of Los Angeles, but in the desert. And so I was ushered into the building. I did the interview, and as I came out of the interview building, there was a very large sort of organizational chart in the lobby area, and it had a kind of list of all the Skunk Works products, starting from Second World War right up to, well, then 1996 or 7. And I was pretty familiar with all of those products, but one at the top of the list was something called Astra, which I'd never heard of. So I confronted my PR escort about this this plane called Astra, and was fairly quickly given the bum's rush out of the building, which sort of told me that I was seeing something I shouldn't have. But then, it sort of plays tricks on you too, because sometime afterwards I sort of re-examined that episode, and I thought, well, maybe if you're being smart and clever, Lockheed Martin or the Department of Defense or the CIA or whoever it is, maybe you'd want me to see that. I mean, it's hard to believe that they make mistakes like that, although occasionally they do. Mm-hmm. So I'm not entirely convinced even now that that wasn't some sort of intriguing kind of disinfo ploy that I was meant to encounter. But you just have to keep your eyes and ears open, and if you can, try and maintain a sense of humor, because the other part of that was when I revisited my diary some years later to check that story out, I noted that the day I visited the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works and was treated to that Astra experience, it was April the 1st.
Right, very good. Now, those tales you're dealing with, if you like, friendly intelligence agencies, but you also, with your Jane's work, have done some defense reporting in the former Soviet Union. How did that go down?
Well, I was very lucky to have been at the magazine at a time of extraordinary change. Every year back in the 80s, during the Reagan administration, the Pentagon would release a document called Soviet Military Power, which was a great big thick book almost, which documented what it believed from an intelligence standpoint the Soviet Union was up to militarily. Mm-hmm. And it was always sort of awaited, in my world anyway, it was awaited with some anticipation, because you wanted to know what the Pentagon thought was sort of up and coming in the world of Soviet military technology. And right up until, I have to remind myself that right up until, months, maybe even just weeks before the fall of the Berlin Wall, no one saw it coming. No intelligence agency saw that coming. So it was a fascinating time to be reporting on all of that for me, particularly as in those years leading up to that, I had speculated on what the Soviet Union was doing in the military aerospace field. That was part of my job. But in 1989, after the wall fell, we were allowed to go and visit those places that hitherto had just been off limits in the Soviet Union. So along with other journalists, I went out to air shows out there, and I interviewed ministers who previously had been, off limits. One of the most interesting trips I went on was in 1991. In fact, it was just after the abortive coup by Soviet hardliners in August 1991.
We're just on the anniversary of it, I think, this week, aren't we?
We are. It's extraordinary. And I was reminiscing about it because I had interviewed just before the coup, I had just done an interview with the Soviet chief of the general staff, so the head of the army, as a guy called Marshal Shaposhnikov. And back in those days, we had to do interviews like that by fax. So I faxed my questions in. The fax came back with his answers. And we ran quite a sort of unusual interview because these people weren't in the habit of talking to Western publications, let alone Western defense journals. And so we'd run this piece in Jane's Defense Weekly, interviewing him. And then the coup happened, and Shaposhnikov was at the time thought to be the sort of linchpin, or one of the linchpins in the coup plotting sort of arrangements, that he was perhaps one of the people behind the coup. So it was a time of great sort of upheaval, speculation. I went across to the Soviet Union a few weeks later and went on a sort of industry trip down the River Volga on a Volga river cruiser, which again was fascinating because we were jumping off at various points down the river for about 1,000 miles and seeing MiG factories and tank factories. And we saw a bunch of stuff that journalists in my position had not been allowed to see then, including going into closed cities like Gorky. It's now Nizhny Novgorod, by the way, but back in 1991, it was the closed city of Gorky, and it was a military city. No foreigners were allowed in, and if you were a Soviet citizen, you had to have a passport allowing you entry and exit from it because there was so much secret stuff going on in there. So, to see the Soviet Union opening up at a time like that as a journalist was just fascinating.
What happened to Marshal
Shaposhnikov?
Yes.
Do you know? I don't know, or at least I can't remember. I think in the end, what happened in the coup, of course, is the coup just melted away. I think the plotters dispatched a few tanks to the Russian Parliament building, fired a few shots at the building, and that, I believe, or I seem to remember, was when Boris Yeltsin came out and jumped on a tank and said, are we going to do this or not? And actually, at that point, the coup just melted away. Thank God. Otherwise, it could have been, extremely unpleasant, and there might have been a civil war.
Now, you were mentioning how nobody saw the Berlin Wall coming down. Well, at the moment, 30 years later, we've also got, I suppose, nobody or a lot of people didn't see Afghanistan going the way it's just gone in the last few days. I see in the notes one of the things you're interested in is what you call the new conflict paradigm with unconventional and hybrid wars. And Afghanistan is surely a classic example of that you've got a high-tech state in the sense of the United States being completely unable to control a fairly raggle-tag bunch of unstructured fighters.
Yeah, it is a prime example of what we used to call an asymmetric war, where you have one side with massive superior technical strength, the United States and its NATO allies, and on the other you have an adversary that is unable to meet them on that battleground. So they have to think out of the box. How do we take on an adversary with that level of strength? And of course, in 20 years ago on 9/11, that capacity to wage asymmetric warfare was brought into horrendous focus with the attack on the Twin Towers. And since then, there have been various other forms of hybrid warfare waged, predominantly against the United States, because the United States is far and away the strongest military power, certainly technologically, in the world. So you get cyber attacks on US infrastructure and indeed our own infrastructure targets. And those could range from sort of military and defense industry type organizations which are plundered for their secrets. So that's sort of one form of hybrid warfare attack or plunder operation. And then, of course, others horrifically include the attack on Salisbury using a nerve agent, which killed a UK citizen. So, these are all different types of asymmetric or hybrid warfare war forms, which confer or are meant to confer kind of equal strength to an adversary when that adversary just cannot possibly gain access to the kinds of weapon systems that a power like the United States is able to wield technologically.
I think we're probably agreed that we've just got to live with it. It's not an issue that's going to go away. It's going to continue, if not possibly getting worse as the likes of state-sponsored hackers build up their skills.
Yeah, I mean, in my estimation, as a former defense journalist, but someone who still keeps a firm kind of weather eye on all of that scene, it makes the world a very dangerous place. We are, unfortunately, living in a very dangerous era. I thought the Cold War was bad. It felt really bad, and it was serious, of course, in the mid 1980s. I think the kind of doomsday clock had shifted pretty close to midnight on occasion. But I suppose, what we couldn't see then, but we can see now, is that was a pretty structured bipolar conflict. What we have now is a multipolar threat environment where there are any number of dangerous weapons at play, including, as we've just discussed, chemical agents. And there are people now who are apparently not afraid to use them. So it just makes for a very unsettling time. And, part of my interests are in working with the aerospace and defense industry, which is what I have been doing, to try and see if there are alternate ways that aerospace and defense sector technology can actually defuse conflict type situations that are brought on by scarce resources. So we live in an era of very scarce resource, which causes competition for those resources, and therefore antagonism, and ultimately, if we're not careful, it can cause conflict. But also climate change. Climate change is a horrible expression, but it's a force multiplier when it comes to threat. Where if our planet is getting hotter and habitats are being destroyed, including water tables that are just disappearing, then again that is putting pressure on countries that are suffering under that regime, the adverse climate regime, to do things that they wouldn't normally do. And one of those things might be to attack your neighbor if your neighbor is seen to have more water than you have. But I think there are ways that the aerospace and defense industry can work with those countries and with large organizations in other industrial sectors to de-risk those levels of risk and potential conflict.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
How'd they do that?
Well, if you go onto my website, which is www.nickcook.works, we started, a bunch of colleagues of mine and I started a pro bono campaign last year, which demonstrated ways in which the aerospace and defense industry can work with the supply chains of other organizations to do things like intervene in the pandemic, which is actually what it did do. You may remember at the very beginning of the pandemic in sort of March last year, here in the UK, the government sort of put a shout out to industry to help, and actually industry off its own bat did in many areas. And aerospace and defense said, well, we can make PPE. We can turn our factories over to making medical protective equipment, which is what it did do. And there are some big companies, both here and in the States, that turned over some of their expertise to doing that. Now, I had previously worked with, a decade and a half ago, some companies, large aerospace and defense companies, who were minded to do the same thing. There was a sort of window after the 2008 crash, and for about 5 or 6 years, where those companies really wanted to explore ways in which they could work with other companies to fight climate change. Mm-hmm. And actually, it'd be a brilliant thing if they would, because if you think about the platforms, as aerospace companies call them, that they build routinely, those platforms which range from satellites in space right down to submarines and UAVs and underwater vehicles of, sort of robotic types, mm-hmm. And everything in between. That's what they build. So these companies know all about the planetary ecosystem, from subsea to space. And what aerospace and defense is very good at is building systems at scale. So they are able to scale things up to a kind of big degree. And of course, that is what the combating of climate change needs. It needs for innovative ideas developed by all kinds of people to be deployed at scale. And so that's what we were exploring a decade and a half ago. And that's sort of come back now it went away, by the way, in 2014 or thereabouts, because Russia annexed Crimea and ISIS popped up as a threat.
Yes.
And those two events really made most of those companies sort of, it was a sort of bit of a slap in the face moment for them, because they suddenly thought, at least this was my interpretation of what happened, is they thought we better get back to doing what we should be doing, which is business as usual, which was a profound shame to me, because we'd made considerable progress to go down that other route that I just talked about. But anyway, I hope very much that it will come back, because none of those problems, as we all know, have gone away. They're all still very much here. In fact, they've just got worse.
Yes. Yeah. One of the things, again, looking at my notes here, you've had meetings with interesting people, some generally regarded as fascinating, others a little bit more of a Marmite. So we've got Arthur C. Clarke and we've got Uri Geller.
Who do you want to start with?
Let's start with Arthur.
Okay. So I think it was in 1990 I met him. My parents were diplomats, and they happened to be based in Colombo in Sri Lanka at the time. So Arthur C. Clarke lived in Sri Lanka, and I'd always been a huge fan of his work, and a massive fan of 2001: A Space Odyssey. So I managed to wangle an interview with him on the basis that it would appear in Jane's Defense Weekly. Yeah. And which is, in fact, what happened. So I went to visit him at his home, and we talked for a couple of hours, and about an hour of that was given over to my formally interviewing him, and that interview, as I say, went into Jane's. But the rest of the time we just chatted, and it was sort of right at the beginning of the time when I started to develop a sort of bit of an esoteric interest in unconventional aerospace platforms.
Yeah.
So Arthur C. Clarke's views on that were of interest to me. He was quite sort of staunchly anti-UFOs in a way. I mean, I don't think he believed in them, or if he did, he certainly didn't want to give the impression that he did. So he was quite keen to refer me to sort of NASA guys who I knew were quite against the whole sort of UFO subject area. So that was a fascinating meeting. Uri Geller, that came about because I wrote a book came out in 2001 called The Hunt for Zero Point, which detailed that sort of esoteric side of the aerospace and defense industry. It was about whether the United States, in particular, had covered up a novel exotic propulsion source, which, I mean, loosely speaking, you could say might have resulted in a technology that would look UFO-like in its capabilities. Mm-hmm. So that book, The Hunt for Zero Point, was a bit of a calling card for me in that whilst it was quite a taboo thing to have written then, given the position that I had and the industry I was reporting on, a lot of people responded to it. Your term, but in a very Marmite way.
Yes.
They either liked it very much, or they loved it, or they hated it. But Uri Geller rang me up and said he'd read the book and he was really interested to talk to me about the research that I'd done for it. Would I come over and meet him? So I said, yep, that would be great. I think he'd just been on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. So my kids were very keen for me to go and meet him. So I did. And I sort of joked to the family about Uri doing a spoon bending trick, not thinking for a second that he would. But the moment I walked into the door, he said, "Hey Nick, do you want me to bend some spoons?" So he did, and then I said to him, "Well, that's amazing, because it really was extraordinary. In fact, actually, if you bear with me a second." So that is the Uri Geller bent spoon.
Wow.
From that time.
Autographed as well, by the look of it.
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
You can see actually it's to my daughter, in
right.
fact. But I'm being its custodian. So that was the spoon. Actually, he bent on the second occasion, because I said on the first occasion, "What a shame my kids aren't here, because they would really love to have seen this." So he said, "Well, bring your family next time. Come back in a week or two. Bring your family. Oh, and bring your own spoons." So my mother-in-law lived quite close by to where he lived, which is just outside London, and so we passed by her beforehand, picked up a couple of her really sturdy Sheffield steel teaspoons. And the second time, because I knew where the teaspoons had come from, and also the second time, Uri never touched the spoons himself. My son Will had a friend of his who was staying with us come with us, and Will's friend was called John. He held the spoon. Uri never touched the spoon. I watched very carefully. As I say, the spoons were ours, and there were two of them. So two spoons, they were sort of nested inside each other. And this time, again, it bent to that right angle, and we watched it happen in front of our eyes, and it continued to bend on the table when John put it down. And I came away, I am actually a believer. He is controversial, as you say. He is Mr. Marmite, but there is no way he could have done that trick, if that's what you want to call it, by subterfuge, because he never touched the spoons, as I say, and they were our own spoons. So, I leave that with the court, but that was my experience of being with Uri Geller a couple of times.
Again, looking at your notes, you've got my notes here, consciousness and the nature of reality. Does that really fit? Would that fit in with Uri Geller then? That there are still lots of things we really don't understand in the world that, defy normal explanation?
I believe that to be true. In fact, I'm rather encouraged that it is that way. I've spent much of my life sort of reporting on nuts and bolts technology, and I've seen a progression of that technology in a certain sector, which is aerospace and defense. And that's, in some ways, is quite predictable. Every now and again, you get a bit of breakthrough technology or a sort of, a particularly gruesome quantum leap weapon system, like, for example, nuclear weapons. I mean, they broke the mold, as it were. And there are others too. Directed energy weapons are another one. So like laser weapons and microwave weaponry. Those are directed energy weapons, and they are breakthrough weapon systems that you don't sort of normally see coming. But I like the idea, actually, that there is a great deal to science that we don't understand, and certainly in some of the people that I have met in the course of my career, whether that's as a defense journalist or doing consulting or whatever, I have met people who've done things that don't conform to our understanding of how things should go in the reality that we know. And Uri Geller is certainly one of them. He was, apart from going on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, he was also thoroughly tested by the Central Intelligence Agency, by the CIA, back in the early and to mid 1970s. And I know the people who tested his skills for the CIA. I've interviewed a lot of them. And so they came away thinking that whilst perhaps some of the stuff that he did was debatable, a lot of it was down to his particular psychic skill set. There was another guy that I knew, in fact, who was the CIA's sort of lead remote viewer. Remote viewing as a kind of psychic spying that was done for many years, as I'm sure you know, and is quite well known now by the CIA from sort of the early 70s through into the early or late 1980s. And his name was Ingo Swann. And I sort of got to know Ingo quite well, and then ended up actually being asked by his family to write a book about him, which actually transcended into something else. I edited a couple of manuscripts that he never got published, and then I wrote a sort of a prologue and an epilogue for that. But those people, what they did and the programs they worked for defied logic and rationality as we would as we would see it. So I do certainly subscribe to the view that there is a lot more that's out there that we just don't know about.
The CIA remote viewing, that was, I believe, set up because there were concerns that the then Soviet Union was also had a psychic warfare program.
Yeah, and actually that's, for a long time, I just thought that was sort of propaganda speak by the Americans. I thought, that it just sounds too convenient to me that you'd start a program in America because the Russians were doing it, the Soviet Union was doing it. But actually, there's massive documentary evidence for that being the case. There's a really fascinating book, which I can't quite lay my hands on right now, but it's called ESP Wars, East and West, which is the story told from both sides, so the CIA side and the American military side of remote viewing, and then also from their counterparts' point of view from the Soviet Union and from Russia. And in that book, they get together and they talk about their experiences in a remarkably candid way. And it's really quite eye-opening as a document. And so it's unquestionably real what the Russians did and got up to. How successful it was is another matter, of course. But the Russians came away saying that they considered it to be as successful as their American counterparts had.
Then the plug got pulled on it in America, didn't they?
Yeah, it came to a screaming halt. I seem to remember in the late 1980s. So it's probably about 1988 or so. But the program itself wasn't revealed until the mid 1990s. I say revealed, declassified and revealed until the mid 1990s. But again, in my Jane's career, I spent an awful lot of time following the Woodward and Bernstein adage, which was follow the money. Because if you followed the money, you would ultimately get to the program that you were interested in. And when if you were to follow the money in the remote viewing program, you would have seen that it was funded year on year for 18 years. And my view was whatever they would have said about it. And at the end, the CIA actually commissioned a document which basically, I'm paraphrasing it, but at the end, it said the CIA view was that none of this worked. It was just an experiment which didn't really bring about any convincing results. Well, if that were the case, why would they have funded it for 18 years consecutively, year on year? So, I don't buy that. I think many people don't buy that. In fact, lots of people I speak to now say that it never stopped in 1988. It kept going. It just went even more classified than it had been before. And when you think about what we were talking about earlier, which is if you are dealing with an enemy from their point of view that does not play by the rule book and does all of that asymmetric warfare thing, so think Al-Qaeda, think the Taliban, think ISIS, you might want in your toolkit a bit of spyware that allows you to get into the mindset of the enemy. So I'm not saying for a minute that they were successful in doing that, but it might just be something else that you'd want to add to your conventional spy book, which would comprise everything from satellites in space through drones, through agents in the field, and who knows, maybe a psychic component as well.
Going back, you talked about your book, The Hunt for Zero Point, which was all about basically, I suppose, anti-gravity. What's the background of that? Is that another of those technologies that the Nazis were supposed to have been experimenting with, or?
Well, that was a part of the story. In fact, it was actually the part of the story that I was least looking forward to, really, because, I got drawn into it because, as I may have said earlier, I was intrigued by the idea that America, which it was always the most interesting place that I ever covered as a technology editor in the aerospace and defense world, partly because it had much more money than anywhere else. It was throwing lots of money at the technology, but also because of there's a real can-do American mindset that, I don't think you see too much elsewhere. You certainly didn't 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago. But I was intrigued by the idea that America might have made a breakthrough, one of those technological breakthroughs that we were talking about earlier, in the field of propulsion. And what would that look like? Well, and how might you cover it up? And as I said earlier, the vehicle that it would look like probably would resemble a UFO. So what I was keen to do, but I was obviously very reluctant to openly admit that I was doing it, was to go and research that story. So I began to, I think it was in about 1991 or two. I great access as a Jane's reporter to all of these companies like the Skunk Works that we've talked to earlier, and the Pentagon and generals and so forth. And so I just sort of said to myself, well, I'm going to go about my normal business, but I'm going to keep my eyes and ears open when it comes to this probing this story, this other story, exotic propulsion story. And I did that for I did sort of 6, 7, 8 years, and I suddenly realized I've got enough material for a book. And that's when I decided to write the book. And it takes the reader from that sort of inception idea, and it was triggered by a rather extraordinary article that landed on my desk when I was at Jane's, which basically said, it was from the 1950s, it said that all of these aerospace companies like Boeing and Convair and Lockheed were looking at anti-gravity technology then. This was in 1956. But by 1960, all of that research had just completely disappeared. It had vanished from the map. And as someone who had covered classified programs, that smacked to me of something suspicious. Things like that don't disappear without reason. So to me, that was another reason to get involved in that story. So it goes from that sort of early impetus for getting involved in the story through experiments at NASA, where NASA was definitely probing in the 1990s, bench-top experiments to alter gravity. And then it sort of took a dive into the classified world. I talked a bit about that. And then it went into Nazi Germany. And as I said, I didn't want to deal with that because you get into all kinds of really murky bits of information about whether the Germans had built flying saucers during the Second World War or not. And I was very firmly of the mind they hadn't. And actually, I came away even more firmly of that view that they hadn't. They were, brilliant engineers and technologists, but that was one thing there was no evidence for them having done at all. And then it ends up in the laboratory of a wild and crazy inventor in Vancouver, Canada, called John Hutchison, who had been evaluated, his skills and technology had been evaluated by the Pentagon, and he was able to do weird experiments, levitating things in his apartment laboratory in Vancouver, mainly upsetting the neighbors, I think, and disturbing the pets, everyone's pets in the vicinity as well. So a wonderful character though, and again a money trail leading to what he was doing. So that was sort of the arc of the book, and for some reason it sort of seemed to catch people's imagination. As I said earlier, it was definitely a very taboo thing at the time for me to be doing, and I make slightly tongue-in-cheek references throughout the book as, when this book gets published, am I still going to have a job? Well, I had some very generous and broad-minded editors who kept me on after the book came out, so it kind of ended up all right.
And still on the subject of books, just as we come to wrap up the interview, you also write fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I started out writing fiction in addition to what I was doing at Jane's way back in the midst of time, and I wrote a couple of novels then. And those were published, but I then got sort of very drawn into the whole Jane's world and the non-fiction world. And also, as you mentioned in your introduction, I've done some ghostwriting as well for other people. So, but I got back into fiction because I became very interested in that whole consciousness thing, as I said, having met the likes of Ingo Swann and Uri Geller and others, and I wanted to write a book about it. I wanted to write originally I thought it would be good to write something in the non-fiction realm about it, but I realized it would actually be a whole lot easier to use the research that I'd amassed in a fictional setting. So that's what I did. The book was called The Grid. It was published by Penguin Random House in 2019, at the end of 2019. And I'm working on a sequel to that. So that's something I do in addition to the other stuff.
In your spare time, yes.
Well, yes, I'm still able to carve out a little bit of spare time, but finding time to do these things is always challenging. But I think, as any writer will tell you, sometimes you just can't not. If the idea is somewhere in there, you've got to get it out. So fiction is fun. I really enjoy it. It's just another thing that I do, but my heart has always really been in the non-fiction realm, but fiction's fun too.
That's wonderful. Well, it's been a delight talking to you, Nick, and thank you very much for your time. All the best with your book projects coming up.
Well, you too, Charles. Thank you very much indeed for having me on, and I enjoyed our conversation very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot indeed. Once again, a big thank you to this week's guest, Nick Cook. You can find out everything you want to know about Nick's books and work on his website, which is at www.nickcook.works. Now, a couple of points of British English to clarify in that interview. I mentioned porky pies in relation to politicians. That's rhyming slang for lies. And also described Uri Geller as being a bit Marmite. For those of you unfamiliar, it's a sticky brown food paste which you spread on toast or use as a flavouring. And its taste is so distinctive that even the company's own marketing campaign is love it or hate it. And as a result, it's a metaphor for something that is an acquired taste or tends to polarise opinion. So a bit Marmite with Uri Geller would be you either love him or you hate him. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you so much for listening in. Please join me again next week for more strange tales for strange times. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, folklore, and the paranormal. You can keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Goodbye.